Okay.
Live. Go ahead, Glenn, while I just finish copying these questions over from the old dead Hangout.
Welcome, everyone, to In the Mood for HTTP, Episode 5. As you can see, we had some technical difficulties, which it looks like we are fortunately over that. Daryl's in the middle of entering in the questions.
Questions are copied over.
Okay. Well,
but it looks like it's just me and you, Glenn. Nobody else has made it over yet. So we could just, chat along for a while. Maybe somebody could. We'll probably just.
Why don't we give a shameless plug of Jonathan Shannon's
good idea.
Content Negotiation HTTP library. So there's always lots of interesting things that are happening around APIs in the open source world, and Jonathan Shannon, who pretty much you can blame for this show even existing, has recently let us know that he has created a new open source library written in Golang, which is for doing content negotiation. Do you want to share that link, Daryl?
I certainly will. What I am just doing is making sure that people have the new link on Twitter for this Hangout. New link.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will actually share my desktop to show his link. Let's see if that'll work. All right, there we go. So you should be seeing my screen, and there you can see Negotiator, which you can find at github.com/jchannon/negotiator, a content negotiation package for web applications written in Go. So if you're interested in doing Coneg and you're building servers in Golang, this might be something that you're interested in checking out. Okay, let's close that.
Okay, we have one viewer, so we're good to go now.
Okay, now let me see if I can disable screen share. How do I do that? Did I just do that? I think I did. Okay, so that gives our shameless plug of the week. Let's move on.
Okie dokie. Shall we start just in the questions that they're entered in here in order?
Sure.
Some of these are carryovers from last week because we didn't get to all of the questions last week. Some of them were just some extra ones that were left over from things we didn't have time for in previous episodes. So this is the first question is, what can the options method be used for? This is a method that is in the HTTP spec, has been there since the beginning.
Correct.
And gets very little love. Yes. And it kind of carries on from our conversation about discoverability that we had, I believe, in episode number 2, was it?
Yep, and I think one of the challenges here is that this is not extremely well defined. It's pretty loose in terms of the semantics.
There is one thing that's defined specifically, is that I believe it's even a must, include an allowed header.
Allow, yes.
Is it allowed?
Yeah, like allow method. Yeah.
What methods are allowed if
yes.
you were to call this resource? So exactly. That's very handy.
Yep.
It's one of those things that a lot of people try and embed into representations that are returned from a server. So arguably you don't need to. You can just query it at runtime. The interesting thing I think about
options. Isn't it true that pre-flight requests don't they use
you're right.
options? There is some option stuff around pre-flight.
Well, for CORS, right?
Yep, for CORS, cross-origin resource. Yeah.
It's kind of been co-adapted for that purpose, I guess, because nobody else was using it.
Yep.
Yep. But so there, the thing is about options is you're not allowed to cache the result that comes from options. So, which is kind of weird because it's like, well, it's metadata that's coming back from the resource. Wouldn't it be good to be able to store that metadata and be able to reuse it for multiple times? But no, the idea being is that it's live dynamic, right? So you might be able to delete this resource right now, but you might not be able to in 2 minutes' time. And there's no way for the server to know when that might change. So
Yes.
can't really use it for storing things, metadata that might last a long time. What you could do, though, is you could include some kind of link, maybe using the described by link relation, that points to another resource that is a longer living resource.
So what about using options as kind of a home resource? You know, like you've talked about, we've had discussions before about home plus JSON, things like that.
Right.
Being that the semantics are not really constrained, is there any problem with using options as a way to get back? And what are the restrictions as far as the payload goes too? Are you able to return a payload with options?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and I think that's the intent. The problem is there's never been any official standard as to what that option should look like, what that payload should look like.
So there'd be
So,
no expectation that a client should be prepared to receive this or that.
right, you can't. You have to do what you're supposed to do with HTTP is look in the response headers, look at the
Sure,
content type, and go,
but you
oh,
could
this.
return a media type.
Oh,
Or,
absolutely. And I've always wondered how feasible it would be to take one of like the API description languages like the Swagger or the RAML and chop it up. So instead of it being an entire document that describes the entire API, you just return a chunk of it that describes that particular resource.
yeah.
And says, okay, these are the media types that it returns. If you post, this is the type of response body. I've never looked into the Swagger spec or any of those to see whether they have any rules about whether or not you could chop it up. But it would be an interesting experiment
Yeah, the place
to
where I
be
was
able to
interested,
dynamically.
the place where I was interested in it beyond just the methods was to say like here's the media types I support, a way of basically returning that list.
Yep.
Tell the clients ahead of time like what are the things that they could expect to ask for.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just there's this funny tension between the dynamic nature of it not allowing you to cache and returning metadata, which generally would be long-lived.
So in
So,
practice, how often do you see clients or even servers taking advantage of the allow header from methods? Like the place where I've clearly seen it is CORS, in the pre-flight request that the browser will do. I believe it generates an options.
yeah.
And that's become kind of a de facto way of doing CORS. Outside of that, have you seen clients that are kind of reactive on what things they make available based on the allow header? And I guess another case is, have you seen people using it for more richer semantics aside from the pre-flight request case? By the way, what I mean by pre-flight, for those that are not familiar, just because we're using this as a general education, if you're trying to do, so cross-origin resource sharing, which is a whole other topic that we probably should put a question on if we haven't talked about it, is you have a like a website, and that website wants to access a resource that is different from the origin server where that web page came from. So then in the browser, you have what restrictions that kick off that won't allow basically accessing that other resource. Modern browsers, and one of the ways that used to be addressed was with JSON-P, which is kind of like a hacky way to do it. JSON-P is a format that allows you to work around some of this because you're kind of like executing JavaScript within, and it runs as script code, and it can do more things. With CORS, you have a set of headers, and there's almost like a negotiation between the client and the server. There are allow origin headers and things like that the server can return. And so where the pre-flight request comes in is if you try to make a request to one such server from within your browser, if you use like the Chrome debugger or IE or whatever, you'll see that it actually issues an options request asking that server if that origin is acceptable, if the origin that the web page came from is an acceptable origin to be able to access that resource. So that's what the pre-flight thing is about.
So we've had some comments in the chat window. Scott Galloway is saying that options becomes a real pain in the butt when dealing with Angular. I don't have a lot of experience with that, so I'd love to hear more about exactly why it insists on you using options. Is it just for cores, or is it for other purposes? And he says it's a pain in the ass.
So I have very little familiarity with Angular, but I suspect that cores is probably the main reason.
Right. And Nick is saying that the core spec actually says you are allowed to cache the pre-flight response. So there's an interesting whole issue of, how religiously should you stick to specifications? And I think it's really interesting to look at these kind of things and say, well, why were they originally said that you're not allowed to cache them?
So is that like an amendment? So is that like an amendment to options that's coming from the core spec? Like in this context, they're saying it's legitimate. I mean, it makes complete sense because you don't want the browser to have to keep going and doing that prefetch because that's a cost.
Well, the interesting thing is Nick also mentions that they use a special caching header called Access Control Max Age. So they've created a whole independent caching mechanism that's not HTTP caching. So, I mean, as I say, there is this kind of conflict between wanting to use options for metadata and not being able to cache it. And one has to question is this time for a willful violation of the spec, because options is not being used for what it's originally intended for. There's very little. The only person I've ever heard talk about options is Keith Casey from Clarify. He would do a presentation regularly about using options, need-defined, and discovery semantics.
Well, the other question is this kind of just taking something that was not used and finding a use for it? Like, if the only use for it is pre-flight that is actually in use, maybe there should actually be like a pre-flight method, so you get more specific. If options itself is not that valuable.
That's true. There could be another method invented. We have another comment from Christian talking about another willful violation of the spec is case-sensitive methods. There's been some interesting discussion about whether or not HTTP methods themselves should be case-sensitive or not. I believe, if I remember correctly after reading the spec, is they are case-sensitive, but there's some tooling that will do things like take in lowercase stuff and force them to be uppercased. So the tooling actually takes care of it. The spec 7231 says they're case sensitive, but most implementations don't care. So, I mean, I think in that case, when it really doesn't matter, you're not losing anything whether it's case sensitive or not case sensitive. So I would say just stick to the spec. In the case of options, I think a willful violation of it where we'll actually allow caching headers, to me, I don't see a major negative effect on the system. It would be definitely interesting to dig into that topic more to try and find out what the original reasons were for. Now, see, if only we had a spec author in the conversation with us that we could actually ask this question to. Right? We'll have to bug Henry.
Go. Yeah, can't you get him on link? Go ask him. I guess it's Skype. Sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Well, this was a very lively discussion. I think for another, for our next call, maybe we should touch on the topic of cores versus JSON-P, and because that's certainly an interesting topic that people do deal with, and what are the downsides of cores as well? Like, it's not a slam dunk. There are challenges. Okay, moving on.
Moving on.
I'll read this. I will read this one.
Go.
Because I won't have an answer to it, so I will do my part in reading the question. What do people think about server and via, or is it via, headers? How can we balance debugging versus security concerns? And this is by this guy, Daryl Miller.
Was it me? I don't know whether I copied this from somebody else.
I think you probably copied it. I think you probably copied it.
No, actually, I think this was me. I had a very long and heated debate with Troy Hunt at the MVP Summit about this particular topic. Um, so here's the issue, right? The idea of the server header is that it provides identifying information that says what implementation of a web server constructed the response and returned it, and the via header is used for intermediaries, like say something like Nginx or Squid, to say, oh, by the way, I got involved in the relaying of this request back to the response. So that when you look at the final response that goes down to the client, you can see, oh, this was created by Apache or this was created by IIS, and it passed through an Nginx proxy, which can be very useful information for debugging. If you want to know why something is or isn't working. I've seen numerous questions on Stack Overflow where people have been trying to do puts and deletes to a server, and I found, oh yeah, you're hitting IIS. Well, by default, put and delete is often usurped by their WebDAV deployment, so go uninstall WebDAV. Obviously, the downside to this whole feature is that now people now know what implementation of your server you're using, and if a vulnerability is discovered in that particular server implementation, then they can now target you.
So, yeah, and that's an interesting question. So getting back to the second part of this about balancing debugging, who are these headers for is a question. And should it be conditional? Like, should you maybe even require authentication, a certain level of auth? Should you tie that to whether or not these headers are returned so that somebody who should be in a position to debug can, and someone who is not shouldn't, to help mitigate the concern that you mentioned?
Well, I mean, if you're building an API, chances are you have auth across most of your API anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a good possibility that it's only an authorized person who is accessing it. Now, you may have free and trial accounts that somebody can sign up for, and therefore anybody could get it if they have an email address that you've done email verification on.
But would you go so far as to say that, hey, like if a system has a notion of roles, maybe this is something that only specific users like that are within the organization that who create the product or who work on the engineering team or who work on the QA team would be able to access, but maybe not make it generally available to everyone?
I mean, that's certainly one way of mitigating the concern. I think there's a couple of other issues. If you read the most recent version of the HTTP spec, what they say is be cautious about revealing too much information. And they specifically, like, don't return like a version number, like a detailed version number of the product. You know, you can say it's IIS, but don't actually say it's IIS version X.Y, right? So that can help to reduce the leak of information.
Because one of the places I saw this come up, where like a real-world use case, was with IIS Node. Because IIS Node is this extensibility, is basically like an extension for IIS that allows you to host Node applications. It's what a lot of things like Azure websites are built on top of, etc. And I remember Tomek adding support that would allow you to explore like what is the environment, like what version of Node is running, what version of this, how much memory is being used, and initially, because IIS Node was just a library that anybody could download, he made that very easy for you to be able to get that information. I don't remember if it was a query string param, but it was useful in the sense that it's kind of black box. Like IIS Node is doing some magic of spinning up Node, and you want to kind of get a sense of why things might be failing. And of course, there's general console output that gets returned. Like from the Node app, it all gets wired back in the payload, in the body. But if there's other things, like will you be able to see what those are about the environment? And I think this was the way that it was done. But I
Yeah.
don't. Yeah.
And I think those kind of debugging tools are fabulous and should always be controlled very carefully as to who to should be able to access them. I think the idea of the server and VIA header is intended to be more publicly accessible. One of the other comments that I've seen regarding this subject is the fact that most of the tools that are used by hackers to try and exploit vulnerabilities just do a blanket attack where they just hit you with every possible attack. They don't bother taking the time to go, oh, by the way, which version of the server are you using? They just go, oh, here's an IP address with port 80 open. Boom, let's hit them with 20,000 different vulnerabilities that we know of.
Right.
So it's
you're saying that the concern there, like although technically there might be something you could do if you knew exactly what the server was, in practice this is not what these hackers are doing.
Yeah, but it's still leaking information. It's still taking bytes over the wire. So do you really need to send it, and is it really adding any value if you have one of these kind of debugging mechanisms where you can allow genuine and authenticated users to get more rich information? Maybe you really don't. I mean, that brings us to the trace method, another method that nobody uses.
Great point.
Which would be awesome if more servers implemented the trace. And for people who aren't familiar with trace, the idea is you make a trace call to a server, the request goes through to the back end, and the server echoes back the request as it sees it back out to the client, so that you can see the impact that intermediaries have had on your request.
Middleware that might have modified the request on its path.
Yeah.
Or even a hacker. Even if you wanted to determine if there was some type of, man-in-the-middle kind of thing or something like that, you could actually see that, hey, this request actually was modified.
Yeah, yeah. So, and unfortunately for security
concerns, but that only works for GET, right? Requests.
It's a good question. Now, I'm presuming it only simulates a GET.
Yeah. Because unless you did something like, the way you can call other methods from the browser using the X override, like you'd have to do something like that because the trace. Yeah. And I don't know if. I mean, I guess conceptually one could write a server that understood those semantics and said, "Oh, you said you're giving me a post, so I will."
Right. Well, and who really wants to risk sending an unsafe method to a server just to see what might happen, right? That's not so. But so there are a whole range of interesting issues here, but I think it boils down to, if you are going to expose debugging information, expose a ton of it and lock it down so only people who should be able to see it can see it.
And doesn't this also relate to the conversation we had about, is it problem, that media type that you can use to describe errors? Like, would you say that?
Well, I perceive HTTP problem as being a truly public-facing problem description.
Okay.
You should
more human readable.
Yeah, and not exposing implementation details. You should be explaining the problem that you are prepared to expose to the outside world.
Which is a great hook for the next question.
Okay, let's move on to the next question then. Are you reading this or am I reading this?
You can go for it.
Okay. So, should we distinguish when the server error is produced by a back-end service versus an intermediary? So, origin server versus intermediary. And this question was asked by our good friend Pedro.
Yep. So I have my perspective here is I don't think you should. And my reason for arguing that is, as a consumer that is talking to an API, maybe it depends, as always, it probably depends. Let's take the third-party API case. I'm just a third-party consumer of an API. Why should I have to care? as far as I know, something's not working right, the service is not available. I would assume that whoever actually owns the API has their own diagnostics where they can determine what is going on. If it's a serious error, they probably should know about it. If not, I can just tell them, hey, I got a 502, and they can look through logs. That's what logs are for, to determine what the detail is. I feel like it's giving unnecessary information. Not only is it giving unnecessary information, it could potentially be leaking detail, like if we talk about disclosure and being able to prevent hackers, like you want them to know the least information about your system as possible. So my perspective on it is, I would say at least for a third-party API, I'd be pretty clear. I feel pretty strong about the fact that I don't need to delineate between the two. If it's like an internal API, that might be a different story. There might be things that the client can do proactively or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I'm just reaching here, but I could imagine a realm of cases where potentially it might be reasonable, but I would see that as more of like in a closed system where APIs are part of the implementation. Even there, I still feel like this idea, if we go back to some of even like the SOA tenets about having very clearly defined boundaries and systems that are more autonomous, independent. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting in that, I mean, the whole idea of the layered architecture of HTTP is supposed to make the layers transparent, right? And if you have a situation where let's say you're in a corporate environment, you're calling an API and it fails and you get a 500 back, okay, it failed, something went wrong. But then if all of a sudden they install a corporate proxy. So now you're making the request through the corporate proxy, and the corporate proxy is then calling the API, and the API fails. And now all of a sudden you start getting back a 502. This is a question. Now all of a sudden it's not transparent.
Right.
Having said that, the rules of client-side status code processing are such that if you get a 500 class error that you do not recognize, let's say you get a 502 and you don't know what to do with the 502, you should treat it as a 500.
500,
so
sure.
Arguably, if you did your client code handling correctly on the client, it shouldn't really make any difference. I must admit, I'm not.
But what about the leakage idea, though? In terms of, but is it information? Like if you think about having a well-designed API and the status codes are not just willy-nilly; they're there for a reason. And you think about, encapsulation and things like that. Is it a detail that the client should know? Is it a concern of the client that the back-end implementation of that API that it's calling is failing somewhere along the way?
If the intermediary is reporting the failure and that intermediary exists on my API provider's infrastructure, no, I don't think they should be returning a 502. If the component that is returning the failure is in my company's infrastructure or my ISP's infrastructure, then maybe I do want to know about it.
But do I want clients that are calling my API to know about it? It just, to me, feels like an implementation detail.
Yeah, we need to explore this more.
I mean, it's kind of like a component. Let's give another example. Like, and I guess this one it might fall down a bit. I call a third-party library. Let's forget there's an API involved. I call a third-party library, and there's some failure kind of deep down in the guts. Well, there, I mean, I guess you would say that because it's running on my machine, I probably want to know all the details because I'm not accessing necessarily an external system.
We should probably pause here for a moment because Mark Nottingham is commenting in the chat window. Let's check what Mark says. It's not a violation. It's a separate cache. Oh, okay, he's talking about the cores. Okay, I wish, Mark, could you answer this question about what is the value of returning 502?
And Mark, thank you so much for joining us. It's awesome to have you here.
As I say, usually what I have found, there is a reason why status codes exist. So we should go and explore more and find out why should the client know that it was a intermediary that received the 500 rather than the why doesn't the intermediary just pass the 500 along? I think for a timeout issue like the 504 gateway timeout, that seems a little bit more obvious because maybe your corporate proxy isn't prepared to wait for quite as long as maybe your client might be prepared to wait for a server to return back. So therefore, you might want to know that, oh well, this isn't failing because the origin server is failing. It's failing because your gateway decided to give up, and it's not waiting for the response to come back, which may be something that you could go and fix.
I see.
So
okay.
That's my thoughts, but definitely 502. I think it's worth exploring some more, and we should get back to that.
Well, I think the bigger topic is interesting that you're bringing up in terms of this general delineation of status codes, and it really raises an interesting question, I think, to me when you start thinking about these third-party APIs that just being very controlled about the kind of information, or being very intentional. Whatever you do, be intentional about it.
About the information that you're exposing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have an upvote for next question, which is the question about client hints. So the question is this just agent detection in better clothes? And I will tell you the little bit I understand about client hints. And I will do that, first of all, by clicking on the link so that I can see the specs so that I don't say anything completely wrong. But as I understand it, what happens regularly is people look at user agents and craft the response that is returned based on information that they divine from the user agent in order to produce a more suitable response for that client. But unfortunately, that leads to the behavior of people pretending they are a user agent they are not, so as to get a particular response crafted a certain way, which in the end defeats the purpose of what the user agent header is there for. The idea, as I understand it, for client hints is that a client gets to say explicitly information about itself so that a server can return a response crafted. And the types of information that might go into client hints are things like, I believe, like client, like the size of the screen, client width, viewport width, those kind of physical constraints.
So it's kind of adding more context to enable content negotiation, or is that like one use case? Like it's giving more.
Well, no, because you're not returning a different media type. Like chances are, it's more in the web browser world, I believe, than the API world.
So form factor type information that leads you to return different results based on knowing the form factor of the client.
Yes. If anybody has any comments.
So if I had a mobile app, let's say, and I know that the screens of the mobile app can only display so much data, and I know that the way that the app is going to work in a mobile context is differently than maybe the amount, and I care about, in a mobile device, optimizing on how much data I pass back less than I care about if I'm just running in an arbitrary browser running on a PC that has a much richer power supply and processor and things like that. Or I guess also you could combine that with thinking about things like edge networks. Like I've got a mobile device running on, say, an edge network. The bandwidth is going to be far less.
Yes, well, one of the client hints is called downlink, that indicates the client's maximum download
Okay.
speed.
Okay. Cool.
So,
So it's not really then agent. Well, when Nick asked the question about agent detection,
mhm.
I guess that's an overloaded term. So what was the? And maybe we can have Nick weigh in.
Well, no, as I understand it, it's a case of a server going, oh, this is the client that's accessing me, therefore I know what that client looks like, therefore I'm going to shape the response in such a way.
So then the answer would be yes. It is an enhancement to the agent detection kind of scenario.
Yeah, but I think more importantly is that by being able to specify these client hints explicitly, it prevents people from lying about what device they have. Because imagine somebody comes out with a new device, right? A new device that should have a new user agent header. But none of the existing systems servers recognize that new device. They're not aware of that new device. So they don't have that special code on the server that says, oh, if it's this new device, then craft the response a certain way.
Sure.
So what ends up happening is the new device ends up pretending that it is equivalent to the device that is going to send it down the appropriate shaped response. So you end up with completely incorrect statistics as to what devices are hitting you because the devices are lying to you.
Yeah, but how does this prevent that? You could still do the same thing here, couldn't you? You could have a simulated, I mean, if you're talking about, so is the scenario here specifically about UI rendering on a web page, or does it apply to just an API that doesn't return any UI? Because why can't the client lie then? The client could still lie.
Oh yeah, no, the client could lie, but it has no motivation to lie. The only reason why clients
I see. What you're saying is the client lies because, got it. Okay, so what you're saying is, totally, I get it now. Makes sense.
Yes. Yes. So now you can declare this is actually the user agent I am, and you can also control what the shape of the response is that you're going to get back. And it works just as well for non-web browser clients too, because let's say I'm requesting an image and I want a very low bandwidth image because maybe I'm going to go and scrape a bazillion images, but I only want to use them for thumbnails. In an application. I don't want the full fidelity image, so I can say, well, I'm going to go get me the stuff, but just only give me a few bytes, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
A minimal number of bytes.
Well, this definitely looks useful.
Yes, yes.
And it is very interesting too to see that the spec is living on GitHub, which is becoming more and more common.
Absolutely. I mean, hey, the whole HTTP working group now has their stuff on GitHub. Okay, so let's move on. We have a question from Scott Galloway, who I think is definitely our most loyal listener. I think.
Why don't we make this the last one, looking at the time?
Let's do that. Any ideas about HTTP2 web optimization, especially with respect to mixed HTTP 1.1 and HTTP2 clients? Ooh. Well, you are definitely hitting on the boundaries of my knowledge. I do believe that it's an upgradable protocol, right? You can start off with an HTTP 1.1 request and it will upgrade transparently.
Yeah.
A resource is a resource, so if you're building an API, there's nothing that says you can't have both an HTTP 1.1 server and HTTP 2 server running behind. If the web server can only support one or the other, you can always have two web servers running, right? The client is completely ignorant of that.
Yes. But I would imagine that there's not going to be HTTP2. I mean, I would imagine that any server that supports HTTP2 is going to support 1.1.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at tradition,
sure.
Traditionally, you're always going to support backward compatible. I think going back to earlier conversations we had on to the key thing that's really nice about HTTP2 is that it doesn't change the way you interface. It's more of an optimization behind the scenes. So there shouldn't be a lot of impact in terms of on the client or server application code that you write.
The one interesting thing there is the fact that, as I understand it, all of the browsers have chosen to only do HTTPS with HTTP2. So if for some reason you really want certain resources to only be served over HTTP, sorry, not HTTPS, then you could choose to serve those up as 1.1. And if they are highly cacheable resources, then you're not going to get any major benefits of header. I'm not sure if you're going to get major benefits of header compression. But then if they are static resources, because they're like images or something that you don't really care about doing HTTPS, you'd probably get a lot of benefits from the multiplexing capability of HTTP2.
I think that, yeah, that is where I hear a lot of the interest. As a matter of fact, I've talked to folks who've said that, you know, even the value of WebSockets is much less in the HTTP 2.0 world because of the fact that you can get more kind of more of a like interleaved bidirectional kind of communication even without WebSockets using HTTP2.
Nick posted in the chat that there is a good article from Nginx talking about a mixed HTTP 1 and 2 environment, and apparently you have to be careful to get the benefits. So it's going to be an interesting world moving forward as HTTP2 becomes more and more viable and people start getting the performance, but obviously not everybody's going to move and not all the resources are going to move over immediately. So we are going to be in a mixed world for quite a while, I believe.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting is like the new, you know, some of the newer stacks will have an easier time. Like Node, for example, I imagine will adopt to very quickly, and you know, hopefully too, like some of the new stuff coming out of .NET land. You know, at least those bits that won't be, you know, because of course in the Windows world you have IIS and some of those constraints that often require changes in Windows themselves. And so one of the cool things I think in this area, looking at like what the new .NET work and how they're supporting things even like libuv under the covers with things like Kestrel, which is allowing them to work around some of those OS limitations that will make it, I think the newer stacks in general that have come up, it's going to be much easier to experiment and to adopt things like HTTP 2.0 in that world.
I mean, IIS on Windows 10 already does support HTTP 2, right? I don't know whether they support all of the features of HTTP 2.
Yeah.
So, but it'll be interesting to see how long it takes for some of the capabilities to filter down through the frameworks. I know.
Yeah, there's still a lot of non-Windows 10 clients out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be nice if that actually were backported down onto older operating systems too? But,
don't hold your breath.
Yeah, there you go.
But I mean, seeing things like Kestrel, I think, are promising because at least there's investment in providing a way, if not, you know, kind of the OS-supported way.
Yeah. Well, it's good to see Nginx is now supporting HTTP 2, so that will clear the way for a lot of folks who have that up front.
Yep, and that will apply pressure to some of the other options that are out there as well.
Absolutely.
Which is good. Everybody will want to be, oh, well, we support that now.
Yes, indeed.
Great. All right.
Okay.
Well, I think we've wrapped up another session. Thank you for everybody who joined us late and bore with our technical issues. And again, really kudos and thanks to Mark Nottingham for weighing in. We did say it would be nice if some HTTP expert could help us out. So certainly be interested in any thoughts Mark has on any of the topics that we discussed today. And we will see you on the next episode.
Yes, and we will try and make sure that you get a little bit more notice for the next episode. We're still trying to find what is the right tempo for these episodes, and I think we're going to push it to a little bit longer, maybe a bi-weekly time frame. And of course, the holiday season is coming up, so but we will give you a little bit more advance warning before the next episode. And with that, with regards to episodes, we encourage anybody who is interested in holding a brown bag type session to make sure they go and sign up for a session on brown bag and host something like this in an area that you have a specialty in.
Exactly. Any topic that you're passionate about. Here's a great platform that will make it really easy for you to do this, and you can get kind of the Q&A level interaction if you're interested in that as well. One other thing, it is a work in progress of making this an actual podcast. So we are working on that. We've made some progress, and we are looking to get those audio files out there so that you can easily listen if you don't have the ability to watch it.
I have a plan. The plan just needs executing on.
Well, a plan is at least part of the problem. Gets us part of the way there.
Anyway, thank you very much, folks, and we will see you next time.
Take care, everyone.